Offensive operations of the Ukrainian armed forces on the eastern front lines continue in Bakhmut, Marinka, Soledad, and Volodar. But with the change in Kiev's war tactics in recent days, the offensive axis of the Ukrainian army has moved more towards the coastal cities than the eastern steppes. Among these cities were front lines such as Berdyansk, Melitopol, Kherson, and Mariupol. The critical change is that the Ukrainians are making to their major offensive plans now targeted Berdyansk, the country's most important coastline city. If you remember, the Ukrainian armed forces carried out one of the biggest offensive operations since the beginning of the war in Berdyansk. Satellite images clearly showed that two large warehouses in the Berdyansk port were completely destroyed, and also that the Azov cable plant was significantly destroyed. But most importantly, the port of Berdyansk was badly damaged in this attack. A missile was seen flying over Berdyansk, but the type of rocket could not be determined due to distance. According to local officials, then there was a big explosion on the port side. According to preliminary assessments, 3 Russian ships moored in Berdyansk harbor were damaged. In addition, 15 ship crews were out of the war as a result of this attack. Russian officials, after initial investigations, stated that the Ukrainian forces believed that the attack in Berdyansk was carried out with United Kingdom-made Stormy Shadow missiles. Considering the position at which the missile was fired and the altitude at which it was launched, the estimates of the Russian authorities appeared to be correct. Information about the attack was also confirmed and officially announced by officials appointed by Russia. According to officials, there were a total of 3 attacks in Berdyansk. They all hit the port city. In addition, the Kremlin confirmed the losses in the initial determinations. The Russian-appointed manager of the city reported that soldiers of the Ukrainian armed forces attacked Berdyansk around 12 o'clock the other day. It is presumed that the target of the Ukrainian army was directly the port itself. In addition, the governor of Berdyansk said that the Russian emergency services are still working. Local residents published the moment of the attack in Berdyansk. Judging by the photos, which show a huge column of smoke and dust rising, the rockets fell into the port of Berdyansk as originally claimed. However, until now, there is no information about the exact target of the missiles. However, it is very likely that Russian Navy ships or the infrastructure of the Berdyansk port will become targets in the future. No official statement has yet been made about the functioning of Russian air defense systems in the region and the possible interception of Ukrainian missiles. But earlier in the week, a pass control was imposed on entering and leaving Berdyansk, which is controlled by the Russian army. Those deemed suspicious were not taken into the city by the Russian forces. This led to the conclusion that the Russian army predicted a possible attack on Berdyansk but did not take any measures against it. So what is the purpose of Ukraine's attack on Berdyansk? Due to its location, Berdyansk is located in the middle of Melitopol and Mariupol. It is quite normal that the port, which has an important place, especially in the supply by sea, is targeted like all Russian supply routes. When the great counterattack of the Ukrainian army is approaching, the shooting of the Navy elements in Berdyansk is of great importance for Ukraine to liberate these regions. In addition, this attack may have been carried out to support an attack on Mariupol and Melitopol, which are among the possible targets of the Ukrainian army. Because the Ukrainian forces carried out effective offensive operations in these 2 cities, a series of loud explosions occurred in the occupied Melitopol area of the Zaporizhia region, with dense smoke seen in the north of the city. The mayor of Melitopol, Ivan Fedorov, personally reported on this stage of the massive offensive operations of the Ukrainians. Later, Mayor Fedorov recorded the appearance of dense smoke in the north of Melitopol after the explosions and also published a photo. Also, residents of Melitopol reported more than 5 loud explosions which were well heard in the northern part of the city as a result of this striking offensive operation of the Ukrainian forces. There was no official statement from the Russian sources about the losses, but the Ukrainian army apparently managed to worry the Russian Navy forces. the Russian officials and their relatives there, because after these attacks of the Ukrainian forces in Melitopol, a substantial number of the population of the city began to evacuate. According to some intelligence reports, the Russian forces in Melitopol had already started to expel their relatives from this city. In addition to the attacks in Melitopol, another stop of the great offensive operations of the Ukrainian armed forces was Mariupol. Numerous explosions occurred in the area of the military base near Mariupol, which was captured by Russia. After the explosions at the base in occupied Yurivka near Mariupol, the Russians arrested almost everyone who had worked at the plant. Petro Andryaschenko, advisor to the mayor of Mariupol, reported this critical news on his Telegram address. Some of the detainees were released, but at least 3 facility personnel from Yalta and Yurivka are still detained in Donetsk. As previously reported, 100 Russian soldiers were killed and around 400 injured when Ukrainian forces struck a Russian base in Yurivka in late May. In addition, in this attack, the ammunition depot of the Russian forces, many pieces of heavy military equipment and the command and control center were destroyed. The Russian military base here also housed communication and warfare systems. Now, with Mariupol being attacked again by Ukrainian forces, the Russians are beginning to fear losing their dominance in this area. Local sources revealed that interesting evacuation cases started in the city after the latest attacks of Ukrainians in Mariupol. It was claimed that the Ukrainian forces also carried out remarkable offensive operations in the Kherson region. Although most of this area is still controlled by the Ukrainians, Russian troops continue their attacks with small attack groups to seize the areas of the islands in the Dnipro and Kherson. But it is not so easy to overcome the defensive fortifications that the Ukrainians have built up to the Crimea in the Crimean Peninsula. Russia does the same. President Vladimir Putin almost surrounded the coastline with walls in order not to lose the peninsula. But the Ukrainian airstrikes on Crimea render the Russians' fortifications on the peninsula's coast insignificant. Crimea is thought to be the last target of the Ukrainians. We will see together when Crimea, which Ukraine's leader, Volodymyr Zelensky promised to take back, will come under Ukrainian control. The invasion-oriented war initiated by Russia in Ukraine increases hatred against Russia while fueling sympathy and support for the Ukrainian people and army. The resistance of Ukraine against the Russian army is increasing day by day. In the world's second-largest army continues to suffer heavy losses. Although Russia increases its attacks on Ukraine day by day and sends additional troops and artillery to Donbass and even launches airstrikes with cruise missiles, it cannot achieve success because now of the Ukrainian armed forces are much more organized, much more experienced, and able to successfully use Western weapons that can crush Russian weapons against the Russian forces. The Ukrainian army is now breaking new records every day in destroying Russian military equipment and weapons. This week, Ukraine's brave marine forces have set a new record with great success in the face of Russian attacks. Ukrainian Marines successfully shot down 6 cruise missiles fired at western cities of Ukraine by the Russian Navy in the Black Sea within 24 hours. This was the record for the most cruise missiles shot down by the Ukrainian armed forces in one day. The Ukrainian Navy officially announced that the Ukrainian Marines shot down 6 cruise missiles sent from the Black Sea over the cities of Mykolaiv and Odessa. Ukrainian Marines used anti-aircraft artillery and portable anti-aircraft missile systems mounted on shore masts and ships to shoot down Russian cruise missiles. With this move, caliber cruise missiles launched from Russian submarines were prevented from beating the cities of Ukraine. At the same time, according to the statement made by the Air Force Command in the region, X-101 or X-555 cruise missiles fired from Russian Tu-95 seconds over the Caspian Sea were also shot down. The previous record of mass destruction of Russian cruise missiles belongs to May 22nd. At that time, the Ukrainian armed forces had a great success in the region by intercepting 4 Russian cruise missiles. It was announced that one of these 4 missiles was shot down by portable anti-aircraft missiles and the other 3 by the air defense system. Volodymyr Zelensky, on the other hand, said in his latest statements that as of June 4th, Russia had launched 2,503 rockets into Ukraine. This incredibly high number is actually the basis of Russia's attack strategy. Russian warplanes have been continuing their attacks using both guided and unguided missiles, especially in the east, and damage the civilian infrastructures of Ukraine. The main purpose of these attacks is to clear the way for the Russian army, which has failed in the ground operation, and to enable it to move more easily in the regions. At the same time, the main purpose of Russia, which targets cities neighboring Eastern Europe, such as Odessa and Lviv with cruise missiles, is to keep a significant part of the Ukrainian army in the west by increasing the losses in the west and to reduce the density of shipments to eastern Ukraine. However, the siege of Kiev showed us that while the Russian infantry and tank troops who thought that the targets had been hit after the heavy bombardments were advancing towards Kiev, it was understood that the defense line of Ukraine stood where it was and was definitely not destroyed. This caused the tanks and soldiers of the Russian army to turn the Kiev and Chernihiv regions into a cemetery. We are talking about a cemetery made of rusty steel of the Russian army. The fact that the Ukrainian armed forces has been able to deal with these missiles in the last period should also have broken the Russian army's insistence on this strategy. But Putin, who makes it his motto to insist on any strategic mistake, never gives up on this strategy. Missiles fired by the Russian army only harm civilians and civilian infrastructures in Ukraine. The Ukrainian armed forces, on the other hand, manages to successfully evade these attacks and remain a strong resistor against the Russian army. Putin's faith in the air campaign must be completely broken because the Russian Air Force's performance in the air war in Ukraine is a complete failure. Russia has fired more missiles in Ukraine since the Second World War than has been fired by any country anywhere. This is a record for Moscow, and the Russian army is breaking this record every day and carrying out more attacks every day. But the Ukrainian armed forces are no longer afraid of Russian cruise missiles and are destroying them more and more every day, breaking new records of achievements that the bombing campaign did little to win Putin's war and revealed important lessons about the future of war. The ineffectiveness of the Russian Air Force in the Ukrainian airspace should also be mentioned as an important part of this lesson. In an environment where Russia is breaking new world records in missile attacks, the shooting down of more than 200 Russian warplanes by the Ukrainian armed forces was a sign. I know the very humiliating situation for Russia, considering that the Russian Air Force is 15 times larger than the Ukrainian Air Force. These figures bring a much more frightening scenario for Russia. Commenting on this situation, experts praise the Ukrainian armed forces while pointing out Russia's failure to take advantage of its overwhelming numerical advantage. Moscow's misstep in not establishing air superiority over Ukraine and Russia's reduced supply of precision-guided weapons. Whatever happens, it seems that Russia has not been making an effort lately to destroy the Ukrainian air defense systems that it tried in the first days of the occupation. This means that the Russian Air Force has not taken the necessary steps to maintain air superiority in the region. There is a very obvious reason for this. With the first light of February 24th, the Russian Air Force attacked the Ukrainian air defense systems and announced that they had neutralized all of these systems. According to the statements made by Russia, the air defense systems in Ukraine were now neutralized, leaving the air superiority completely to Russia. However, in the following days, it was realized that this was not the case, and the efforts of the Russian Air Force were observed to be in vain. With the increase in the military arsenal of the Ukrainian armed forces, the Stinger portable air defense systems transferred to Ukraine in the later days of the war, the necessity of these operations by Russia became more questionable. Even if the fixed air defense systems were destroyed by the Russian Air Force, Ukraine had a sufficient number of portable air defense systems, and these air defense systems could take on tasks at least as impressive as the fixed air defense systems in the hands of Ukraine. These portable air defense systems launched from the ground to the air once tried to oppose the U.S. Air Force in the U.S. operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. However, the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Army found a solution in this regard. The U.S. Army used Stingers in airborne attacks to protect its own army and marched to victory by blinding the air defense systems in Iraq. But Russia's failure to follow this path has become a key feature of the Ukraine war, confusing Western observers. After 48 hours of attacks on the Ukrainian air defense in the opening salvo of the war, Moscow seemed to have given up on maintaining this American war precondition in Kiev. The Stingers were divided among the soldiers very quickly, and the Stingers created the so-called Po man's supremacy. The seemingly weak Ukrainian air defense has become a nightmare for Russian warplanes in Kiev. Putin had to face a great disappointment. He could not get efficiency from the steel piles. He trusted neither on land nor in the air in Ukraine, and he lost the advantage at the point where this war has come. It has begun to be interpreted as Putin's wrong strategy. The war is now thought to have turned into a war of passion between Putin and Ukraine. Putin will not be able to restore the lost reputation of Russia and himself. For now, his only aim seems to be to win a victory that will strengthen his hand in the upcoming elections and to strengthen his own authoritarianism with its propaganda. No one can predict the outcome of this right now, however. The Ukrainian army, with its advanced Western weapons, can destroy Russian military equipment both in the air and on the ground. We hope that Ukraine regains its territorial integrity and freedom as soon as possible. A lot of news today is coming from the Donetsk region here. The Russians have been pushing along the whole front line, and in some parts, the Ukrainians also conducted a number of counterattacks when it comes to the Avdiivka group. As you remember, the main goal of the Russians here is to take Avdiivka into a pocket by advancing from two directions simultaneously. However, encirclement from the northern part proved to be extremely challenging for the Russians for a variety of reasons. Firstly, the Russians have to cross the road that is located on the embankment. Secondly, after crossing the embankment, they immediately fall in the lowlands in front of Krasnohorivka. And thirdly, the Ukrainians control an artificial mountain terracone. So because the Russians here are at a significant tactical disadvantage, they seem to have stopped assaulting Krasnohorivka altogether. But the same cannot be said for the area to the south of Avdiivka because here the Russians continue to push every day. The Ukrainians are also very active and counterattack the Russians whenever there is an opportunity to do so. Firstly, the Ukrainians conducted a counterattack on Opiton, which unfortunately was unsuccessful. As of now, they are controlling a powerful checkpoint to the north of the settlement. While the Russians controlled the settlement itself, the Russians tried to assault this checkpoint from Opiton in the past, but their attempts were unsuccessful. It seems like both parties struggled to push each other out, so we may not see rapid changes in this region very soon. That is why the Russians seem to have switched to defense mode here while waiting for the Russians in Virginia to attack this checkpoint from the back. And the Russians in Virginia seem to maintain a high intensity of attacks. According to Russian sources, they successfully took the northern part of the village, but this is the third time they claim control over it, with no indication that this is the case. According to Ukrainian sources, their attacks were upheld, and judging by the action of the Ukrainians, it seems like the Russians may lose the initiative today. The Ukrainians have attacked the Russian rear positions near Pisky in order to undermine Russian positions in Virginia. Their main idea here is to block Russian reinforcements. It is highly unlikely that the Ukrainians want to maintain their positions here for a long time because the Russian counterattack is imminent. That is why this operation should have been conducted to achieve short-term goals. And the fact that the Ukrainians are trained to limit Russian supplies and support of Virginia in the short term means that the Ukrainians are preparing a counterattack to free Virginia completely. In the meantime, the Russians are moving in the direction of Navalsky. Recently, Ukrainian sources confirmed that the Russians made marginal progress here and took control over certain checkpoints. Nonetheless, there are attempts to move further. Cost them a lot as they basically have to storm the fields with infantry that finds itself at a crossfire. Some say that the main idea behind taking over Alaska is to cut supply to Krasnohorivka. At first glance, it seems like a good idea because given that the southern roads are too close to the front line and cannot be used, this should be their main supply route. This means that if the Russians cut this main road from the north, then the Ukrainians in Krasnohorivka should be in the operational encirclement or simply trapped. However, this is not true. If we look closer, we can see that there are many other roads that lead to Krasnohorivka from a lot of different settlements. It is true that these roads are paved, but given that the temperature is below zero and that the Ukrainians need to travel only a few kilometers, it is obvious that the Russians aren't even close to endangering this supply and support of this group. Even if the Russians take Navalsky and establish fire control over the northern paved road, overall, the situation on the Avdiivka-Krasnohorivka segment of the front is quite stable and there is no imminent threat to the Ukrainian positions.